Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd.
A psalm from David.
The Lord is my shepherd.
I shall not want.
He makes me lie down in green pastures.
He leads me beside still waters.
He restores my soul.
He leads me in paths of righteousness
for his name's sake.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
I will fear no evil.
For you are with me.
Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies.
You anoint my head with oil.
My cup overflows.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me
all the days of my life,
and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Hey guys, if you're okay with it, I'm just gonna jump right into things today with you and ask you a really big question that's gonna involve some introspection, but I wanna ask you this. What tends to scare you? Like, what are you afraid of? And it's gonna be different for different ones of us, and maybe for you, you're scared about certain financial things going on right now. Like you're concerned about whether you're gonna make it in the next coming weeks or months, or how you're gonna make it, you know, or maybe you're afraid of losing a job or losing income, or maybe it's relational. Maybe you're scared that you'll never find the right person to spend your life with, or maybe there's a relationship you already have that you're afraid of how it's going right now, or maybe it's a situation with school. You're afraid of how the next year is gonna go, or your job, there's so much uncertainty. Maybe you're scared of just what is going to happen in life with COVID, or a million other things. I could list a lot of examples, but I want you to be thinking about what is it that tends to give you a little bit of fear? What tends to scare you, you know? And then the second question, the follow-up question is, how does your fear tend to manifest? Like when you're afraid, we handle fear differently, and we handle different fears that we each experience differently. So I'm curious, when you get afraid, what does it look like? Are you a person who tends to just kind of cover it up by busyness? Or do you tend to panic and have anxiety and have worry? Do you tend to lash out in anger because fear is just too scary itself, so you kind of turn to anger? Or what is it that looks like when you get afraid? What does it look like when you are scared? And now a third question, a little bit hopefully maybe better question, is what would it look like? I want you to just imagine what this would look like if you were not afraid, if you were not given to fear, if you didn't, not in the sense of, just hear me out, not foolishly like, oh, I have nothing to worry about, I'm not scared of anything, just because you're foolishly ignoring it, but I mean like secure in things that allow you to be unafraid and not given to fear. Like I can hardly imagine what it would be like to drive in my car with Madeline and have her not be afraid of my driving. Like, but can you just imagine? Can you just imagine what it would be like to live in a world where we weren't afraid of things like my crazy driving or something like that, or afraid of the things that we thought of earlier that are maybe a little bit more significant than that? Because the reality is we each have different fears that manifest in different ways. Like each and every one of us, you and I, we're alike in a lot of ways. We have different fears that manifest in different ways, and that can lead us to believe that we have different solutions for how we will deal with these fears. But instead, what I want to suggest to you today is that we're actually offered an ancient remedy that has been offered for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. I mean, generations of people have used this, and they've found that it worked. I mean, it has caused, this remedy, the timid to become bold. It's caused it's eased worried and anxious hearts and minds. And it's given people a sound mind to process challenges as they face them and have profound wisdom in how to solve them. This is what we're offered today. And we're gonna cover some serious ground today, just to let you know. We've been in this series for a couple weeks now, Psalm 23, going slowly, and we've actually even had 1 week where we camped out on 4 words: He restores my soul. And I enjoy doing that. But today we're going to go ahead and kick it into high gear, and we're going to dig into the depths of a whole verse that encompasses 30 words. So strap in and get ready, because we're going to go through a whole verse here. We just heard it a minute ago, but I want to read it again. Psalm 23:4 says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Now, I don't know about you, but it feels like 2020 has been the perfect year for us to talk about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. I mean, I just want to remind you of what this year, even though it's about halfway over, we're at the halfway mark, and this is already what we've dealt with: the unexpected death of Kobe Bryant and one of his daughters in that crash. The raging fires in Australia that destroyed millions of acres of wild land and then billions of wildlife as well. There was the Ukrainian flight going over Iranian airspace that was shot down. There was the deadliest shooting spree in Canada's history. We've watched as the Dow Jones dropped faster in one day than it ever had since 1987, which honestly, for some of you watching, is before you were even born. And we've seen, obviously, the death toll from COVID-19 absolutely devastate China, Italy, the United States, the UK, and so much of the world. We've watched, because of COVID-19, the death of dreams. Like anybody who hoped that 2020 was going to be their year for competing in the Olympics or the Tour de France or climbing Mount Everest, every single one of them being closed, those dreams died with it. And then a little bit closer to home, there was the suicide of a dear Ark Church pastor, and mourning that loss. And then obviously there's been the death of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. It seems like, death has always existed, but it seems like 2020, this year, has been under the shadow of death more than any other year that I can remember in my life. It just really feels like it's been heavy that way. And so it seems so appropriate we'd be talking about this today. And it's interesting because David, the one who writes it, was so qualified to write about the shadow of death because he knew about the shadow of death. As a shepherd himself, there was at least once that we know of that he faced a lion attack and once a bear attack separate to go ahead. They were attacking his sheep and he had to defend his sheep from these beasts that absolutely could overpower him. And then after that, he has a combat moment where he is face to face with a giant known as Goliath, and he has to, with a sling and some stones, go face to face with this giant, this professional murderer. And then the sad irony is that victory that he wins over Goliath ends up having a domino effect, and it leads to him becoming actually an enemy of the state. And then suddenly he's finding himself dodging spears in banquet halls that are being thrown by his enemy / boss / king / best friend's dad. This is the world that David lived in up until at least the point that we find him writing Psalm 23. David knew that sheep sometimes even have to venture, because he was a shepherd, he knew that sheep sometimes have to venture through a shadow of death because the best resources are on the other side of that valley of the shadow of death. Think of it. Cliffs flanking either side of these valleys would be perfect possible homes for anything in that environment, such as coyotes, bears, wolves, cougar. Any of those things could live in those cracks and crevices up in the canyons. And then it sure gives those wildlife, those predators, a pretty good vantage point of the sheep, doesn't it? Think of it. They get a great view of where those sheep are heading and all that. And then you also got to think these valleys that real shepherds would take their sheep through would also be the potential hiding spots for thieves and unsavory people. Just think of years later when Jesus would tell a story of the Good Samaritan, and he would refer to the fact that there were thieves hiding in the same kind of region that David would have written about. And as if all of that wasn't enough, then there's also the possibility when you go down into a valley that a sudden storm, especially in this area of the world, a sudden storm, even one that you don't even get to be rained on in that spot, can start a flash flood that could rip its way through and could absolutely decimate the whole flock. So for sure, it can be easier when you think about it to travel through a valley with a flock of sheep rather than trying to get them on a rocky, angled mountainside and getting them to travel on that. And it can be reasonably imagined, because we're pretty intelligent people, that there's more water and more lush vegetation down in the valley than there would be maybe on the mountainside. And it can be, honestly, that the valley may be the only route to the open pastures where the herd really needs to get to. But at the same time, these valleys can be dangerous business. So whether the valley of the shadow of death is referring to a shadow that death itself causes, or whether David's referring to the shadow that causes death to be a possibility, either way, David understood them both. And both are not warm and fuzzy. Like, these are not a good thing. And yet he determined and declared, in spite of all of this fear possibility, I will fear no evil. Evil, by the way, meaning distress and injury, calamity, or misery. He's saying, I don't fear that stuff. Which is a bold thing to say. Can we just take a moment and can you just imagine what it would be like for you to look at all the possibilities we just went over, of all the things that could go wrong, all the dangers inherent in walking through with a whole flock of sheep through a valley, and yet being able to say, I will fear no calamity, distress, or anxiety or worry. I won't fear it. Like, can you imagine what it would look like in your life to be able to say that with bold confidence? And yet he's able to say that bold thing because of another bold thing that he also says. He says, for you are with me. Now, I know school has been funny this year, and maybe for some of you it's been a while since you've been in school, but back in my day when I went to English class and all that, I remember them telling us that for and because, they're kind of like each other. For and because, they're prepositions that speak to relationship. Basically, this is due to that. And so it's that sense that this is due to that. They're related to each other. So I'm a sheep in this metaphor that David's painting for us by God's inspiration. I'm a sheep traveling through the valley of the shadow of death. And somehow I don't fear evil. But that's all because the Good Shepherd is with me. Like, those two are absolutely linked up in this verse. It reminds me of Matthew 28:20, when Jesus even promises his disciples something very similar. He says, as he's departing and going up is ascending to heaven, he says, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Jesus promises, even though I'm leaving, I'm still with you. I'm never leaving you. And Jesus, as we know, is love personified. He is God. God is love. And 1 John 4:18 says that there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. This is the reality that we're told about in the scriptures. See, listen, friend, fear is based in shadows. That's why it makes so much sense to have fear and shadows put together in this verse. Fear in those shadows are the appearance of what could be. And I'll tell you this, our enemy, Satan, loves operating through shadows. It makes me think of maybe a few decades earlier in the history of the Israelite people, when they were in the age of prophetic leadership. And there was this woman named Jezebel. She was a queen, but she was an evil queen, and her husband was just about as evil too. And what ends up happening is Elijah, as a prophet, goes and has a showdown with their people, Jezebel's people, and just Elijah, the prophets of Baal, and him representing God. And there's a showdown where all of a sudden God shows that he's way stronger than the prophets of Baal. And there's some craziness that happens. But then Jezebel, it's so weird. She sends a messenger, and she sends a messenger to Elijah, who's hiding off in the wilderness, and just says, I'm coming for you. Just so you know, you embarrassed me, and you kind of do whatever, but I'm coming for you. I'm going to get you. And it's weird when you think about it, because she doesn't actually send troops to finish him. She sends messengers to frighten him. Like, she's more interested in that. Because that's the thing, these shadows, the way that Satan loves to work against us, it's all about torment. Just planting seeds of fear, seeds of anxiety, and seeds of worry, planting them into our minds and planting them into our hearts so that we can feel that shadow of death, that sense that something's going to go wrong, and I can just feel it, I just know it. I mean, Elijah gets absolutely jacked up by Jezebel's threats. It's that potential of evil that could be feared. And I'm just curious, as we're kind of processing this personally, for you, what shadows have tormented you? Maybe not just past, long time ago, like remembering, I'm saying like maybe more recently. What shadows of death have kind of been tempting you to be tormented? What sleep has been robbed of you because of certain things? Like what's keeping you from getting a good night's sleep because of the fears and the worries and the anxieties? But I've got some good news for you as well, because I want you to understand how shadows work. Shadows indicate that there's light. Like we know that, right? Shadows indicate that there's light. They only exist because light does too. And I don't know about you, but I've heard in my Bible that light shines in the darkness and the darkness cannot overcome it. So no matter the darkness, there is light. No matter the valley, there is light. Jesus promises he is with us. Matthew 28:20, we just read it. He promises, I'm with you to the very end of the age. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. He's right there with you. He's right there with you wherever we go. He's right there in the living room. He's there. And in the dorm room, he's there. And in the vacation house, if you're able to go to one, he's there. And in the line that's wrapped around a couple times at Chick-fil-A, he's there. In the line at Popeyes, maybe not. Well, anyway, but in the hospital room, he's there. In the financial valley that you might find yourself in right now, he's there. In the frustration that you just keep on having, he's there. In the heartbreak that you're going through, he's there. And in the uncertainty of life, he's there. You know, I really love how another psalm puts it so well when it comes to like these questions of, is God really there when this is going on? Is God really there in this moment, in that moment? Psalm 139, 7-8, and I'm going to read it in a New International Version, says, kind of posing it as a question actually, where can I go from your spirit? Like where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. And then I'm gonna grab my Bible and encourage you to do the same, because Hebrews says it again. So it's Old Testament, but it's also in the New Testament. It's in the Old Covenant, it's in the New Covenant, and it's said a little bit differently. So Hebrews 13, 5-6 says, keep your life free from the love of money, which for you might just kind of seem like, where are we going with this? This doesn't seem to connect, but it does. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for God has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? So I'm curious, like the fears, he talks about financial fears here, but the fears that can kind of just wreak havoc in our lives and cause us to be so concerned. He's reminding us, remember, he says, I won't leave you and I won't forsake you. So why will we fear? What can man do to us? Like, what fears could be dealt with in your life if you and I could just learn the contentment that comes with knowing that God, the Good Shepherd, is still with you, is still caring for you, is still watching over you. Like that he meant it when he said, in this world you will have tribulation, but that don't worry, you can have peace knowing I've overcome the world. This is the kind of God that we serve, and this is the thing he promises us. And so I want to take a moment here, if I can, and I just want to encourage some of us that are watching this right now. I want to encourage you with something that's on my heart to say, that it might be time for some of us to learn to walk through the valley of the shadow of death rather than camping out in the valley of the shadow of death. Like, you've spent enough time here, and God's looking to lead you through. You know, as I look at the passage we're reading today, I see that God gives us the strength to endure devastation even. That we endure, we walk through. He gives us the power to walk, not to embrace devastation and sit in it. He gives us the strength to endure devastation, not embrace devastation. And I want to challenge some of us. It's time to get up from sitting and feeling like you need the strength to keep on sitting in it and start walking through it. If you want God to heal you of torment, you need to be willing to hand it over. And it's cool because right before David wrote about the valley of the shadow of death, we discovered that God leads us on paths of righteousness. So if we stick close to him, the Spirit and the Word of God are going to guide us in the right and righteous paths that God has for us. So it might sometimes, get us into some valleys and all that, but he's going to lead you through it. Which, by the way, gets us to the final section of this verse for today. And honestly, hopefully you've been sticking with me here, because I almost made this last part a separate message just because there's so much in these verses, but I wanted to kind of keep it brief. And so we're going to keep it brief and just kind of read over these last few words. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And I want to let you know, I looked into it, like I've been doing some research on this whole passage. It's intriguing to me that shepherds actually make rods. What they'll do is they'll go into the bush and they'll find a sapling and they'll dig it out and all that kind of stuff. And they'll take the part that where the trunk meets the roots, which is the widest part of it. And they'll clear off all those roots and they'll start polishing it and sanding it and smoothing it down to a point where it actually ends up being a bit of a knob. And that's the round head of the rod. It's a very, actually, this rod that they have, it's a little shorter and all that kind of stuff. It's a very personalized part of a shepherd's very meager supplies for their job, because it has to be perfect for their hand. And as I was reading this shepherd writing about what it's like to be a shepherd, he said that it's basically an extension of that shepherd's arm and his strength and his power. I mean, just think of it this way. Do you remember back in Exodus when God went and sent Moses, a shepherd, to go and free the people of Israel out of Egyptian slavery? And what does he go ahead and use to demonstrate his power through Moses? Moses' rod. He tells him to throw it down and it becomes a snake. And he uses Moses' rod in a lot of ways to show victory and authority over Pharaoh. And so this rod would be an instrument, just so you know, that the shepherd would use to discipline or correct wayward sheep that were wandering. But they'd also use it to go ahead and protect the sheep from an attack from a lion or a bear or anything else that would come and attack. The rod would be both used for danger outside as well as the correction of the sheep that would need to be corrected harshly inside as well. But the staff, so the rod and staff, they are actually different. The staff would be a longer stick. It would have a hook on the end of it. And this one would be used in different ways. For instance, one thing would be to pull a newborn lamb up to its mother, if it had fallen down, up to its mother so it could feed without the shepherd having to touch it, because if the shepherd touched it, it might have the smell of human on it and the mother might refuse to take care of that sheep then. So the staff would allow that to be brought back into relationship. Or it could be used to guide the sheep, to go on the right path. Kind of reminds me of like a loving, tender touch. Like if I'm walking with Madeline and I want to kind of like guide her as we're talking, I might put my hand on the small of her back. It's that tender kind of touch. And then sometimes the shepherd, honestly, I found out, will just put as they're walking with the sheep, maybe through a valley of the shadow of death even, and they'll just put the staff on the shoulder of the sheep. It'll just be touching it, not guiding it, leading it, just touching it. And it's kind of almost like keeping in touch, literally, with a favorite or a pet sheep of theirs. It's kind of like almost like walking hand in hand. That sense of intimacy of I'm with you, and I just want you to know I'm right here. I'm right here with you. And during this pandemic, I've just seen so many things offering to walk hand in hand with us. I watched as the government, as it always wants to do here in America, offers to hold our hand to help us get through this valley of the shadow of death. And of course, Republicans and Democrats both fight over who holds our hands better. And then I've also seen as stability and normalcy try to hold our hand. If we can just get back to being normal, if we can just get back to stable, and it offers to hold our hands and get us through, if we can just get back to a new normal. And I've watched as accomplishment offers to hold our hand and get us through. If we can just make a lot of things happen during this pandemic and while we're quarantined. Or I've watched despair and just give up hope and you just embrace despair or food or Tiger King or sleeping in till noon. And so many other random good, bad, and ugly things offering to hold our hand as we journey through what has been a crazy year full of all kinds of shadow of death moments. But I don't know about you. I am so thankful that God also offers his hand. Like, I'm so glad that God says, listen, he invites us to journey through some of the toughest moments we've ever gone through, but simultaneously to journey through them and not be afraid, to not fear, to not be consumed in worry or anxiety. He offers comfort. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me, both through a staff that gently guides us and lifts us up, as well as through a rod that not only protects us from outside attacks, but also even allows us to be corrected when we become a danger to our own selves. Obviously, this is a metaphor, but God works in powerful ways to do this. And that correction, I know, is kind of a hard way to find comfort, but again, I want to throw another scripture at us. Psalm 119, verse 67 and then 71. David writes, he says, before I was afflicted, not a happy word, before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. It is good, verse 71. It is good for me that I was afflicted. Can you imagine? Like, David writing this, it just seems crazy to me, but he says, it is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. Like, that I might learn what you want and how I can please you and how I can live life abundantly. It was good that I was afflicted. It's a sheep going, you know what? Man, it hurt when you hit me with that rod, but that was good for me. And so God says, listen, as we go through the valley, there's going to be some hard times ahead, but I'm not leaving you. I'm not going to forsake you. I'm going to bring you to good places. You just got to trust me. And sometimes it's going to involve some correction. Sometimes it's going to involve some moments where fear will make sense to you, but trust me. I've got you. I've got this. And the reason that this is comforting, this rod and the staff is comforting, because no matter what, he's doing what's best for us. Now, it may not always seem that way. When we start getting into the dip of the valley, we start dipping down to go into it. Or when we start thinking, you know what, I don't know if I don't know if this is good. Like, God seems to be leading me in a way, my definition of good might be different than God's definition of good. But it is the good shepherd's faithfulness that brings us true comfort. It's his faithfulness that we can trust him, that we can know that he's good. And I don't know why I still struggle sometimes to remember God has brought me through other hard times. He'll bring me through this. It's his good faithfulness that allows us to trust the good shepherd. And so that leads us to our declaration for today. If you're a note taker or if you're not, you might want to write this one down. Here's our declaration for today. I'm fearless because he's faithful. I'm fearless because he's faithful. You know, I think of what boldness it must have taken David to write, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Friend, I don't know where this message finds you right now. I know how God has a way of oftentimes working it out at just the right timing. So I'm hoping and praying that for you, the Holy Spirit is just laid on your heart or reminded to your mind an area where you are struggling with fear, where you are concerned, worry, anxious, whatever words you want to use. But the reality is that you feel like you're walking through right now some sort of valley of the shadow of death. There's a Jezebel maybe even who's trying to torment you and send messengers of, you just wait, I'm coming for you. Maybe it's not even right here. It's just the possibility, the shadow of it that scares you. And I know, and I want you to know that these things can be very real and valid, and I'm not trying to dismiss them and make light of them, but instead I'm trying to shine light on them. That the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. Jesus promises us, no matter what we see in front of us, his faithfulness should stir some faith that we can believe he's got this. No matter what you're going through, surrender it to him. For some of you today, that means you got to finally make the decision to give your life over to him. You've been trying to maybe do your own thing and maybe even mix in a little bit of Jesus, but it's time to really make him the Lord of your life. He's got to be the one calling the shots. It's not time to play church. It's time to really surrender your life to Jesus, confess your sins, and begin walking in step with what he has for you. And then for some of us, it's a matter of remembering that we are saying we follow Jesus and we're his sheep and part of his pasture. You need to trust that he's got you. I want to pray for you this morning. God, I pray for every one of us who is going through a valley right now where it feels like the shadow of death is coldly sitting on our shoulders. God, I pray that there would be, in this moment, as we look to your word and its comforting truths, that your rod and your staff are leading and guiding and correcting and disciplining and watching over us. And no matter what, you are with us. And so because you're with us, God, we don't need to be afraid. God, I am fearless because you are faithful. Would you help us to not just have that be a quick and trite saying, but would it stir up in us a new level of faith that you are worth being trusted? God, for some of us, today is the day we trust you with our lives and our souls. For the first time, we surrender them to you. And then God, for others of us, it's a time where we remember and we kind of let you speak to certain things in our lives maybe that we've been holding on to the fear of. Instead, we want to hold on to your faithfulness and allow that fear to be released. God, would you do a profound work in our church this morning? In Jesus' name, amen. I love you. My prayer for you today is that you not only would get through the valley of the shadow of death because of the faithfulness of God, that you'd find victory and you'd find freedom, you'd find joy, you'd find peace, you'd find calm. But that as you and I learn what it looks like to trust a faithful and good shepherd that can cause us to be fearless people, that we would then be a bit contagious in spreading that kind of faith into those around us, that we would be people who speak full of faith, but that we also live in ways that encourages others to know that that's a possibility. So may you go into this week not just enjoying it for yourself, but let's get some other people to realize that even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we don't have to be afraid.